to start with the fact that this audience is probably aware that this issue has been getting a lot of attention. The question of how can universities be doing more responsive research. And we see all the ways that our research can contribute to the massive societal challenges that are facing our state and the world. But we and others have identified a lot of the ways in which the institutional supports and the incentive structures have not been aligned, despite the fact that our mission is there. But that's what this work is really grounded in.
For those who don't know, Pew is a public charity whose mission is to improve public policy, inform the public, and invigorate civic life. And through the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, we're working with a group of funders who recognize and believe that maximizing the public impact of their research investments is an important precondition to achieving any of those goals on issues of pressing societal concern. And that often includes, for members of TEFN, investments in engaged research, investments in evidence use infrastructure, and investments in research that is closely tied to those most proximate to a problem, whether they be government decision makers or community members or both.
So to give a little bit of context, the scan that we'll be talking about was commissioned by the Transforming Evidence Funders Network, or TEFN, which is a group of a variety of funders who are focused on creating the systemic and long-term changes necessary to transform how evidence is generated, mobilized, and used. The goal was to provide an overview and comparison of promising attempts to reform and strengthen faculty advancement incentives to reward societally impactful research. So this wasn't meant to be a systemic review, but really highlight some exciting emerging areas.
So as we expected, there's a lot of variation across institutions. And accordingly, there are a lot of diverse points of intervention depending on the mission, the governance structures, the size, the resources, culture, etc. Innovations in terms of capacity building, workshop series, and then other kinds of internal mechanisms that support the work of doing societally impactful scholarship. This issue of sort of where does change come from and where are the change stories? I think it's very much what we would call a yes and on the fact that having the bottom-up faculty and investigator support is critical, but also obviously having support, quote unquote, at the top from provosts and chancellors, et cetera. As we think about doing this work across campuses and within our own campuses, sort of where do you stake the tent in terms of what's the focus? And then as you all are aware of, thinking about some of the broad alignments in terms of other kinds of allies and incentives in the research ecosphere. It clearly doesn't make sense for us. We know that faculty evaluation, as well as our public impact, is something that happens in a broader ecosphere. So we can't really just be making change institution by institution. Another theme in terms of our framing was really thinking about external investments and also internal investments on the level of the faculty member in terms of actually supporting the scholarship, but then also thinking about the institutional change makers and how you support those of us who are trying to make changes on universities, not just in terms of funding, but also in terms of capacity building and networking, focusing on the infrastructure and the institution itself, and then this broader possibility of funding networks that can really lift all boats and connect and promote that kind of knowledge exchange and best practices exchange.
And yeah, I would just say that, the scan really showed that there's so many different forms of innovation that are occurring in this space and with so many different types of actors within and outside of academia. So there seems like there's a lot of really exciting potential there. Sort of any progress is helpful in terms of what's going to get us all the way over the finish line and most efficient. I do think this coordination of funders and disciplinary associations and even things like journal editors and internal institutional capacity, we'd love to see that all happening in tandem. There's so many different sort of points in which there could be some challenges in this work. And so having more, cohesion across different actors in this area is definitely something, I think from the scan, we would be very interested in seeing continue to develop.
We've been struck by just how much ongoing activity there is in this space, both at individual universities and across the ecosystem, including through organizations like HiBAR. And so I think this project has offered a recognition that the funder's role is really to accelerate the progress that's been happening and that's been led by champions at their universities and across the ecosystem, rather than necessarily to launch a lot of new initiatives, and that there are levers for change at a number of different entry points across universities and across these networks, that our network can support the coalescing and acceleration of a lot of these exciting cross-campus national and international initiatives. And the importance of evaluation of these institutional change efforts. And I think many of us hypothesize that these lead to changes in who in fact is getting promoted, what type of research is getting recognized, and that in turn those kind of institutional changes filter down to other outcomes of impact, whether they be in the community or within the university, but that there's a real need for deeper understanding of the way in which those impacts happen through institutional change.
So some of these have to do with how do we know what are most effective change processes, addressing some of the scope and sampling limitations of our current scan, considering who's aligned for leadership, or sort of what are sort of effective leadership for institutional change, how to best support cross-site knowledge that can strengthen impact and support careers, and how do we move forward with understanding of systematic evaluation of how we do this work well, and what its ultimate impact is in terms of broader societal impacts.
Institution, we know that there's a lot of, peer influence when it comes to universities. So one, being able to capitalize on that if this isn't already happening on their campus. And then additionally, to avoid reinventing the wheel, the fact that, University of Minnesota's Twin Cities has a lot of these kinds of structures in place with example documents and meeting agendas and whatnot, for a university that's newer to come to this, to be able to draw upon some of those existing resources, especially given that, as was noted in the scan, not everyone's getting funding as an institutional change maker to do this work, so they have to fit it in where they can.
A key part of the portfolio are the evaluations from other universities, from what are considered peer universities. And so it makes no sense to do anything that would just be focused on our own university, because such a core piece of the evaluation is coming from our peers. And so even just from that very simple slice, we see how this operates in an ecosystem rather than in terms of sort of individual universities. But if you think about the ways that the ecosystem also includes who you're funded by, where you publish, everything that has to do with establishing what is considered impactful, high quality scholarship is determined in a peer context, in a broader ecosystem. So I think we really have to be working across networks to do that. Many of us come to this with different kinds of language that all have to do with being impactful, while also doing research that contributes to our literatures and to knowledge generation more broadly. On the one hand, we want to have this sort of umbrella and coherence, but it's clearly not one size fits all. And I find that, on our own campus, in my own school of public health, there are many faculty who are doing what we would consider high bar research, who would not identify with a community engaged frame. We struggle with even what to call it within our own university, because we try to be as descriptive as possible rather than using terminology that is only going to make sense in certain disciplines. I mean, I think the more inclusive the kind of language we can use, I think people do see themselves. We had this event a few weeks back, sponsored by and organized by our Vice Chancellor for Research, with our group. And it was incredible who came out and who saw themselves